The darkness was a living thing in our bedroom. It pressed in, suffocating. The only light came from the digital clock mocking me. 3:17 a.m. I hadn't slept properly in months, not since the spring thaw revealed the rot beneath the surface of my marriage. My phone vibrated, a single, insistent buzz that echoed through the quiet house. I knew who it was. I knew what it was. I almost didn't want to look. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness I'd been cultivating. I grabbed the phone. "Francis?" "Of course." The message blazed on the screen, mocking me. "Sold our Cape Cod beach house and transferred all our savings to start my new life with Jessica. Enjoy being homeless, LOL. Don't bother calling. Changing my number tomorrow." The words swam before my eyes. 30 years. 30 years of shared dreams, whispered promises, and a life built brick by brick, reduced to this: a text message, a digital middle finger. Enjoy being homeless. The LOL seared my soul. He actually thought this was funny. He thought he'd won. I'm Alice. Alice Mercer, 52 years old. Wife. Mother. Hospital administrator. And apparently, a fool. My breath hitched. I wanted to scream, to shatter every precious thing in this suffocating room, but a strange, detached calm settled over me. The kind that comes before a storm. He thought he was so clever. He'd been playing me for months, maybe years. The gym, the business trips, the goddamn personal trainer. Jessica. I knew. I'd known. The gut doesn't lie. But I'd chosen to ignore it, to believe the lies, because facing the truth was too much to bear. But not anymore. He'd made a mistake. A fatal one. He'd underestimated me. He thought I was weak, complacent. He thought I was stupid. He was so wrong. I tapped out a reply, my fingers trembling only slightly. 3 words, cold and precise. Check your account balance. I set the phone down, the words burning on the back of my eyelids. He thought he'd destroyed me. He was about to learn what I was truly capable of. The taste of Earl Grey did nothing to soothe the churning in my stomach. I sat at my desk, the pre-dawn light painting the room in shades of gray. Before me lay the folder, marked simply Francis. Inside was everything. Every lie, every deception, every carefully orchestrated move he'd made in his betrayal. It was a chronicle of my slow awakening, from denial to fear to finally, furious resolve. It started subtly. A credit card bill, a charge for $500 at Elite Training Solutions. $500. A week. He who always complained if I bought a pricey hand cream. Then the ATM withdrawals. $2,000 here, $3,000 there. Always just below the amount that would trigger a bank notification. I'm not confrontational by nature. I negotiate contracts, manage staff, diffuse crises. I solve problems. And I'd treated Francis's behavior like a problem. I'd started documenting photos of receipts, copies of bank statements, dates and times of his business trips. I felt like a detective tracking my own husband. It was sickening. Then Diane, our family lawyer, her face had been grim when I'd laid out my suspicions. Document everything, Alice. Every single thing. So I had. The forensic accountant, Mr. Chen, discovered the hidden account. Offshore, no less. He'd been so proud of himself, thinking he was so clever. The real estate agent? The draft emails. The listing of the beach house. Our beach house. The house my grandfather built. The house where I scattered my mother's ashes. That was the turning point. The phone call. I'd come home early with a splitting headache. Laying in bed, trying to shut out the throbbing in my skull, I'd heard his voice, muffled through the closed door of his office. Jessica, baby, it's all coming together. The beach house should sell quickly. Alice has no idea. Once that money hits our account, I'll transfer everything to the offshore account we set up. By the time she figures it out, we'll be living the dream in Bali. The world had tilted. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed about my life, shattered in that moment. The next day, I visited Judge Martinez. She'd seen this 1,000 times before. The predator, the unsuspecting spouse, the calculated betrayal. She listened patiently, reviewed the evidence, and then she acted. The Emergency Asset Protection Order, issued immediately, freezing everything. He wouldn't be able to touch a single dime. He was trapped. He just didn't know it yet. Now, sipping my tea, waiting for his inevitable call, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. He thought he'd outsmarted me. He thought he'd gotten away with it. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. The fury that had been simmering beneath the surface for months was about to boil over, and he was going to feel the heat. The first ring sliced through the silence like a knife, then another and another. 4 rings. I needed those 4 rings. To compose myself, to steel my nerves, to remind myself why I was doing this. I answered, "Alice, what the hell did you do?" His voice, thick with rage and panic, crashed through the line. The sound of paradise crumbling. "Good morning, Francis," the first said, my voice calm, almost pleasant. "I see you checked the accounts. This is my money," he screamed. I could hear the desperation underlying the anger. "Our money," I corrected, "from our 30-year marriage. Money we saved together. For our retirement. For the children's future. I'll fight this," he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I imagined him stepping away from Jessica, trying to hide the disaster unfolding. "You won't get away with this." "I already have," I said, my voice steel. "I've gotten away with protecting what's legally mine." Judge Martinez was particularly interested in the recorded conversation where you discussed, and I quote, "leaving Alice with nothing while we live it up in Bali. The beach house transaction has been voided, by the way." The buyers were very understanding when their attorney received the court order. Silence. Just his ragged breathing. Then, a female voice in the background asking questions, growing increasingly agitated. "Is that Jessica?" I asked, my voice laced with amusement. "You might want to let her know that the offshore account you set up has also been frozen, and the authorities have been notified about potential tax evasion." "You've been spying on me?" he finally managed, his voice hollow. "No, Francis," the first said, my voice firm. "I've been protecting myself from your calculated betrayal. There's a difference." Muffled arguing on the other end, Jessica's voice rising. Their dream, their little paradise built on my family's money, was evaporating in real time. "Francis," the first continued, "the court has scheduled an emergency hearing for Monday. You're required to attend, either in person or via video conference. Your passport has been flagged, so I suggest you make arrangements to return." Flagged? What does that mean? The panic was palpable now. It means that while you can leave Bali, you'll be detained when you attempt to enter any country other than the United States. The judge was concerned you might attempt to disappear with marital assets. The argument in the background intensified. I could make out Jessica saying something about promises and wasting my time. "I've emailed all the court documents to you," I said. "Diane suggested I also copy your brother Michael. He's an attorney. He called me this morning, by the way. He's disappointed." That's an understatement. He was furious, offering to fly to Boston immediately to help me navigate the legal proceedings. "My brother has lost his mind," he spat. "Dad would be ashamed." "Alice, wait." Francis's voice had changed now. Desperation replacing anger. "We can work something out. We will." "Through the proper legal channels," I replied. "I suggest you find a good attorney." "Oh, and Francis, the children know everything. They've seen the evidence. They've read your text." I hung up. My hand was shaking. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let the silence wash over me. He had no idea what was coming. The next 48 hours were a blur of phone calls, emails, and legal consultations. Francis tried calling 17 more times that day. I only answered once, informing him that all future communication should go through our attorneys. After that, I forwarded his calls to Diane's office. By evening, Francis's brother, Michael, had arrived at my house. He brought legal expertise and moral support. He'd reviewed everything. He was appalled. "Alice, you did everything exactly right," he said, spreading documents across my dining room table. "The evidence is overwhelming. The judge's protective orders are solid. What do you think he'll do next?" I poured us both coffee. "He'll double down," I said. Francis never admits defeat. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Jessica. "Miss S. Mercer," it began formally. "I feel I should inform you that Francis misrepresented his financial situation to me. He told me the beach house was his alone, inherited from his parents, and that you had agreed to a divorce. I never would have become involved had I known the truth. I am ending our relationship effective immediately." Michael read it over my shoulder. "Rats and sinking ships," he murmured. "Should I respond?" I asked. "Absolutely not," Michael advised. "Forward it to Diane. Let her add it to the file. Jessica might be trying to position herself as an unwitting victim here." The next morning brought news from the forensic accountant. Francis had made several attempts to access various accounts overnight, trying different passwords and even attempting to change the recovery email addresses. Each attempt had been logged and reported to the court. "He's digging himself deeper," Diane said during our morning call. "The judge takes attempts to circumvent court orders very seriously." By midday, we received word from the attorney in Cape Cod that Francis had called the real estate agent, demanding they proceed with the beach house sale despite the court order. The agent, already aware of the situation, had recorded the call and sent it directly to Diane. "This is actually helpful for our case," Diane explained. "It demonstrates his intent to violate the court's orders, even after being formally notified." Thomas and Elise came over for dinner that evening. They'd both taken personal days from work. They were still processing their father's betrayal. "Mom," Thomas said as we sat around the kitchen island, "have you heard anything about Dad coming back?" I shook my head. "Not directly, but Michael thinks he'll have to return soon, if only to try to defend himself in court." Elise, always the more emotional of the two, pushed her food around her plate. "I still can't believe he texted you like that. Enjoy being homeless." "Who says that to someone after 30 years? "Someone who thought he'd gotten away with it," Michael replied, joining us with a stack of new documents. "Which brings me to this. We've just received notification that Francis has booked a flight back to Boston. He lands tomorrow evening." I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that he was returning to face the consequences, anxiety about seeing him, and a strange sense of validation that my preparations had worked. "He's also sent a formal communication through a Balinese attorney," Michael continued, sliding a paper across to me. "He's claiming the text was sent as a joke and that there was a misunderstanding about the beach house listing." "A joke?" Elise's voice rose in disbelief. After we saw all the evidence, Francis's return to Boston played out like a carefully orchestrated legal ballet. Diane had arranged for a court officer to serve him with papers the moment he cleared customs at Logan International Airport. Michael's colleague waited in the terminal, sending us live updates as events unfolded. "He just arrived," Michael reported, reading from his phone as we sat in Diane's office. "Looks shell-shocked. No sign of Jessica." "Court officer approaching now." I nodded, maintaining my composure, though my heart was racing. After 30 years of marriage, I knew Francis well enough to anticipate his response. First denial, then bargaining, followed by misdirected anger, and finally, when all else failed, tearful pleas for forgiveness. "Alice," Diane said gently, "are you absolutely certain you want to be present at tomorrow's hearing?" "You could authorize me to represent you fully." "I need to be there," I replied. "Not for Francis, but for myself. I spent too many years being invisible, accommodating his needs and dreams at the expense of my own. Elise squeezed my hand supportively. Both our children had insisted on joining me at the law office, forming a united front as we navigated this painful chapter. 2 hours later, Francis's newly hired attorney called Diane. They requested an emergency meeting before the hearing, a last-minute attempt to negotiate. They're offering a settlement, Diane explained after the call. Francis is willing to allow you to keep the beach house if you'll drop the emergency orders and agree to a quick, quiet divorce. Allow me? I repeated, the absurdity almost making me laugh. The beach house that's been in my family for 4 generations? Exactly. Diane nodded. It's not a serious offer. They're fishing to see what you might accept. Tell them we'll see them in court, I said firmly. That evening, as I was preparing for bed, my phone rang with Francis's brother's number. Alice, I'm with Francis, Michael said, his voice tense. He's asking to speak with you before tomorrow's hearing. I've advised against it, but he's insistent. I took a deep breath. Put him on speaker. But stay in the room, Michael. Alice. Francis's voice sounded rough, defeated. This has all gotten out of hand. I made a terrible mistake. Which mistake exactly? I asked calmly. Planning to steal our savings? Attempting to sell my family's beach house? Or texting me that I should enjoy being homeless? I wasn't thinking clearly, he stammered. Jessica, she made everything seem possible. A new life. A fresh start. But she's gone now. The minute she realized there wasn't any money, she disappeared. How surprising, I remarked dryly. I want to come home, he said, his voice breaking. We can put this behind us. 30 years, Alice. Doesn't that count for something? For a moment, I remembered the young man I'd married. Ambitious, charming, full of dreams. We were going to build together. But that man had disappeared long ago, replaced by someone willing to destroy me financially and emotionally without a second thought. It counted for something, I replied softly. That's why I documented everything so carefully. That's why I protected what we built together. And that's why I'll see you in court tomorrow. I hung up. I sat on the edge of our bed, my bed now, and allowed myself a moment of grief for the marriage I thought we had. Tomorrow would require all my strength, all my dignity. The courthouse was imposing, formal, all polished marble and echoing hallways. I sat beside Diane at the plaintiff's table, my posture straight, hands folded calmly on the polished wood surface. Thomas and Elise sat directly behind me, while Michael had positioned himself halfway between our table and where Francis would sit, a visual statement of his divided loyalties but ultimate support for the truth. When Francis entered with his attorney, I was shocked by his appearance. The confident, tanned man who had left for Bali 3 weeks ago looked haggard and diminished. He attempted to catch my eye, but I kept my gaze forward, focusing on Judge Martinez as she entered the courtroom. We're here on the matter of Mercer versus Mercer, the judge began, reviewing the documentation before her. I see temporary asset protection orders were issued 3 weeks ago based on evidence of attempted fraud and financial abandonment. Francis's attorney, an aggressive litigator named Gregory Powell, immediately stood. Your Honor, my client wishes to assert that there has been a serious misunderstanding. The text message in question was sent in poor judgment, but was never intended. Judge Martinez cut him off. Mr. Powell, I've reviewed the extensive documentation, including recorded conversations, email drafts regarding the unauthorized sale of jointly owned property, and multiple attempts to access frozen accounts after court orders were issued. Let's not waste this court's time with implausible explanations. Powell sat down, chastened. Francis seemed to shrink further in his seat. The hearing proceeded methodically. The forensic accountant presented his findings, showing how Francis had systematically withdrawn nearly $900 in small amounts over 4 months. The real estate agent testified via video conference about Francis's instructions to sell the beach house without my knowledge. Most damning was the evidence from Francis's own devices, the emails, the offshore account set up, the conversations with Jessica planning their new life. When Francis finally took the stand, he attempted a strategy of contrition. "I made a terrible mistake, Your Honor. A midlife crisis that got out of hand. I never actually intended to leave my wife destitute. Yet your text message specifically stated, 'Enjoy being homeless,'" Judge Martinez noted, looking over her glasses at him. I was showing off for Jessica," Francis admitted, his voice barely audible. "I wanted to impress her." The judge's tone made it clear how she viewed this explanation. After 3 hours of testimony, Judge Martinez delivered her ruling. The court finds overwhelming evidence of attempted fraud and financial abandonment. The temporary orders freezing all marital assets will remain in place pending final divorce proceedings. Additionally, she continued, fixing Francis with a stern gaze, the court finds Mr. Mercer in contempt for his multiple attempts to circumvent these orders after notification. She assigned a court-appointed financial guardian to oversee all marital assets during the divorce process and ordered Francis to surrender his passport. Most significantly, she granted my petition for exclusive use of our Boston home and the Cape Cod beach house during proceedings. "Mr. Mercer," she concluded, "the court takes a very dim view of attempts to hide marital assets or deliberately impoverish a spouse. You're fortunate that Miss Mercer discovered your plans before you succeeded." As we gathered our things to leave, Francis approached, ignoring his attorney's attempt to stop him. "Alice, please," he began, his voice breaking. "Where am I supposed to go?" I looked at him directly for the first time that day. "That's a question you should have considered before telling me to enjoy being homeless," I said. "I'm sure you'll figure something out." 6 months after the court hearing, I sat on the deck of the Cape Cod beach house, watching the October sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, ending our 30-year marriage with the stroke of a judge's pen. The final settlement had been fair but firm. The court awarded me the beach house outright, plus 70% of our retirement funds and investments, citing Francis's deliberate attempt to defraud. Francis received the smaller of our 2 cars and enough liquid assets to secure modest housing. He'd been ordered to pay my legal fees in full. "Mom?" Elise appeared at my side, the sea breeze tousling her hair. "Thanks, sweetheart." I accepted the steaming mug, wrapping my hands around its warmth as the evening air cooled. Thomas emerged from inside, phone in hand. "Uncle Michael called. Dad's finally found an apartment. He starts his new job at the community college next week." I nodded, feeling neither joy nor sorrow at the news. Francis had lost his executive position after the scandal. His former company wanted nothing to do with someone who'd attempted such calculated financial deception. "Are you okay?" Elise asked, studying my face. "I am," I replied, surprised to find it was true. I never wanted Francis to suffer. I just wanted to protect what was rightfully ours. As the waves lapped gently against the shore, I realized that while Francis had lost nearly everything, I had gained something unexpected. Strength I never knew I possessed and a clearer vision of the life I wanted to build moving forward. 1 year to the day after receiving Francis's cruel text, I stood at the podium in Boston University's conference center, addressing a room full of attentive faces. The event, Financial Security After Betrayal, had drawn over 200 attendees, mostly women over 50 facing situations similar to mine. "Preparation isn't paranoia," I told the audience. "Documentation isn't distrust. They're forms of self-protection that everyone deserves." After my case had been covered in the Boston Globe, I'd received dozens of messages from women who had experienced financial abuse but hadn't known how to recognize it or protect themselves. Their stories had inspired me to team up with Diane and several financial experts to create this workshop series. In the front row sat Thomas and Elise, both beaming with pride. Beside them was Michael, who had become an unexpected ally and friend throughout the divorce and in the months following. In the months since finalizing my divorce, I had found purpose in helping others navigate similar situations. As for Francis, the first had heard he was slowly rebuilding his life. The last update from Michael mentioned he was teaching business ethics at a community college, an irony not lost on anyone in our family. Jessica had apparently moved on to another affluent target in Florida. After the presentation, as people lined up to ask questions, an older woman grasped my hand tightly. "My husband of 42 years is planning something similar," she whispered. "Thanks to you, I've already contacted an attorney and documented everything." Her words validated everything: the pain, the public exposure, the difficult decisions. What Francis had intended as my destruction had instead become a foundation for helping others. As I drove home along the familiar coastal route to Cape Cod, I felt something that had been absent for too long: peace. Not because Francis had faced consequences, but because I had found strength I never knew I possessed. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty isn't revenge. It's resilience. The beach house was different now. It was still the same structure, the same weathered shingles, the same salty air clinging to the porch. But it felt lighter, as if the years of unspoken resentments and silent compromises had finally been aired out with the ocean breeze. I'd spent the months since the divorce decluttering, not just the physical objects, Francis's golf clubs, his worn-out armchair, his collection of hideously ugly ceramic frogs, but the emotional baggage as well. Each item I tossed felt like shedding another layer of the past. The house was becoming mine. I repainted the living room in a soft, calming blue, the color of the summer sky just after dawn. I replaced the heavy drapes with sheer linen curtains that danced in the breeze. I filled the rooms with artwork I loved, pieces that spoke to my soul, not carefully chosen to match the furniture or impress guests. The kitchen, once a source of silent tension over whose turn it was to cook, was now a haven. I experimented with new recipes, invited friends over for impromptu lunches, and finally learned to bake sourdough bread without setting off the smoke alarm. The garden, neglected for years, was thriving. I planted hydrangeas in shades of pink and purple, their blooms spilling over the edges of the flower beds. I built a small herb garden near the back door, the air fragrant with rosemary, thyme, and lavender. It wasn't just the house that was changing. I was changing. I enrolled in a pottery class at the local art center. I'd always admired ceramics, but I'd never allowed myself the time or the indulgence to pursue it. Now, my hands were covered in clay, and I was creating bowls, vases, and sculptures that, while imperfect, were undeniably mine. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with over the years. We went for long walks on the beach, shared bottles of wine on the porch, and laughed until our sides ached. I even considered dating. Online profiles seemed daunting, but a few of my friends had nudged me, insisting that I deserved to find happiness again. So I reluctantly created an account, filling it with recent photos and a brief description of my interests. The messages that flooded my inbox were interesting. Some were genuine, some were clearly scams, and some were just plain creepy. But one from a man named David caught my attention. His profile was simple, straightforward. He was a retired architect, a widower for 5 years, and enjoyed hiking, reading, and cooking. His photos showed a kind face, etched with laugh lines. I hesitated for days before replying. The thought of opening myself up to someone new, after what I'd been through, was terrifying. But something about his profile felt safe. So I sent a message. "Hello, David. Your profile caught my eye. I especially appreciate your mention of sourdough bread. It's been my nemesis for years," he replied almost immediately. Ah, sourdough. A worthy challenge. Perhaps I could offer some tips? Over coffee, perhaps? Our first date was awkward. There was a tentative quality to our conversation, a careful probing as we navigated the unfamiliar territory of getting to know each other. He was taller than I expected, with a gentle smile and kind eyes. He wore a worn-out denim jacket and carried a small, well-loved book of poetry. He had a quiet confidence that I found strangely comforting. We talked about our lives, our interests, our families. I told him about my job, about Thomas and Elise, about my love for the beach. I carefully avoided mentioning Francis, his betrayal, and the divorce. It felt too soon, too raw. He listened patiently, asking thoughtful questions. He seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. By the end of the evening, I felt lighter, as if a small weight had been lifted from my shoulders. We went out again, and again. With each date, I found myself relaxing, opening up, sharing more of myself. He was a good listener, offering support and encouragement without judgment. He never pried, never pushed me to talk about things I wasn't ready to share. He liked to bring me flowers, wildflowers he'd picked on his morning hikes, a single rose from his garden. He cooked me dinners, simple, delicious meals made with fresh ingredients. He read me poetry, his voice soft and soothing. He was kind. It had been so long since I'd experienced genuine kindness, without the expectation of something in return. It was healing. One evening, as we sat on the beach watching the sunset, he gently took my hand. His touch was warm, reassuring. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "you don't have to carry all this alone." I looked at him, tears welling up in my eyes. I hadn't realized how heavy the burden was until he offered to share it. I told him everything. About Francis, about Jessica, about the betrayal, the divorce, the financial ruin he had tried to inflict. He listened patiently, his hand never leaving mine. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes, didn't try to minimize my pain. He just listened. When I was finished, he squeezed my hand. "I'm so sorry you went through that, Alice," he said softly. "You didn't deserve that," I cried. I hadn't allowed myself to truly grieve the loss of my marriage, the loss of the life I thought I had. But with David, I felt safe enough to let go. He held me close, letting me cry until I had nothing left, and then he kissed me. It was a gentle kiss, a tentative exploration, but it was also hopeful. The relationship with David progressed slowly, deliberately. We took our time, building a foundation of trust and respect. He understood my need for space, my occasional bouts of sadness, my lingering anxieties about money. He never pressured me, never made me feel like I had to be someone I wasn't. He introduced me to his friends, a group of warm, welcoming people who embraced me without hesitation. I introduced him to Thomas and Elise, who immediately liked him. They could see how happy he made me. One day, as we were cleaning out the garage, David stumbled upon a box filled with old photos. They were from my wedding, from family vacations, from Christmases past. I froze. I hadn't looked at those photos in years. They were a painful reminder of what I had lost. David gently picked up one of the photos. It was a picture of Francis and me, young and smiling on our honeymoon. "You were happy," he said softly. I nodded. I was. Once. He put the photo back in the box. "It's okay to remember the good times, Alice," he said. "They were real. They were part of your story." He helped me sort through the photos, reminiscing about the memories they evoked. We laughed at the silly poses, we cried at the poignant moments. By the end of the day, I felt a sense of closure. I had finally acknowledged the past, not denying it, not running from it, but accepting it as part of who I was. I packed the photos away in a box, along with other mementos of my marriage. I didn't throw them away. I just put them in storage, in the attic, out of sight, but not out of mind. I was letting go. A year after the workshop series, I received an invitation to speak at a national conference on financial abuse. I hesitated. The thought of sharing my story on such a large platform was daunting. David encouraged me. "You're making a difference, Alice," he said. "You have a voice. You need to use it." I accepted. The conference was held in San Francisco. I arrived a few days early, wanting to explore the city, to soak in the culture, to prepare myself mentally for the speech. I walked along the Golden Gate Bridge, marveling at its grandeur. I wandered through Chinatown, savoring the sights, sounds, and smells. I visited Alcatraz, imagining the lives of the prisoners who had been confined there. I felt alive. The day of the speech arrived. I was nervous, but I was also determined. I wanted to reach as many people as possible, to empower them, to give them hope. I stood on the stage, looking out at the sea of faces. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told my story from the beginning to the end. I spoke about Francis, about Jessica, about the betrayal, the divorce, the financial ruin he had tried to inflict. I spoke about the fear, the anger, the sadness, the resilience. I spoke about the importance of preparation, of documentation, of self-protection. I spoke about the power of community, of support, of hope. When I finished, the room was silent, and then the applause erupted. It was thunderous, overwhelming, heartfelt. People stood to their feet, cheering, clapping, weeping. They lined up to thank me, to share their own stories, to ask for advice. I felt humbled. That evening, David took me to dinner at a small Italian restaurant in North Beach. We sat at a table by the window, overlooking the city lights. "You were amazing, Alice," he said, his eyes shining. "You inspired so many people." I smiled. "Thank you," I said, "for being there for me." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Always," he said. We ate our dinner in silence, enjoying each other's company. I looked out at the city lights, sparkling like diamonds in the night sky. I had come a long way from that dark, suffocating bedroom, from that cruel text message, from that feeling of utter despair. I had survived. I had thrived. I had found love again. I had built a new life, a better life, a life filled with purpose, passion, and peace. The future was uncertain, but I was ready. I was Alice Mercer, and I was finally free. Years passed. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. David and I built a life together, filled with love, laughter, and shared adventures. The beach house became our sanctuary, a place where we could escape the noise and chaos of the world and reconnect with each other and with ourselves. Thomas and Elise thrived. They both married and started families of their own. I became a grandmother, a role I embraced with joyful abandon. The beach house echoed with the sounds of children playing, of laughter filling the air, of new memories being made. Francis faded into the background, a distant memory, a ghost of the past. I rarely thought of him, except when Michael called with occasional updates. He never remarried. He continued to teach business ethics at the community college, a job he seemed to find fulfilling in its own way. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life. One day, Michael called with news that stopped me in my tracks. "Francis is sick, Alice," he said, his voice somber. "He has cancer. It's advanced." I felt a strange mix of emotions: shock, sadness, disbelief. It had been so long since I'd felt anything for Francis, but hearing that he was dying, it stirred something within me. "He doesn't have much time," Michael continued. "He's asked to see you." I hesitated. The thought of facing Francis again, after everything that had happened, was unsettling, but something inside me compelled me to say yes. "I'll go," I said. Michael arranged the meeting. Francis was living in a small apartment in a quiet suburb of Boston. He was frail and weak, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken. He was lying in bed, hooked up to in the fourth drip. He looked like a shadow of the man I had once known. He smiled weakly when I entered the room. "Alice," he said, his voice raspy. "Thank you for coming." I sat down in the chair beside his bed. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words. "I'm sorry, Francis," the first said, finally breaking the silence. "I am sorry for what you're going through," he nodded. "I deserve it," he said. "I made a lot of mistakes. I hurt a lot of people." He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm especially sorry for what I did to you, Alice," he said. "I was selfish. I was cruel. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. Tears welled up in my eyes. I reached out and took his hand. His skin was thin and papery. I forgive you, Francis, the first said. I forgave you a long time ago. He squeezed my hand weakly. Thank you, he said. That means a lot to me. We talked for a while about the past, about the present, about the future. We reminisced about the good times, about the children, about the life we had once shared. He told me that he had thought about me often over the years, that he regretted his actions every day. He said that he was proud of what I had accomplished, that he was happy that I had found happiness again. As I prepared to leave, he took my hand again. Alice, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Thank you for everything. You were a good wife. You were a good mother. You deserved better. I leaned down and kissed him on the forehead. Goodbye, Francis, the first said. He closed his eyes. Goodbye, Alice, he whispered. I left the apartment and walked out into the sunshine. I felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. Francis died a few weeks later. I attended the funeral. It was a small, quiet affair. Only a handful of people were there, Michael, a few of Francis's colleagues from the community college, and me. As I stood by the graveside, listening to the minister speak, I thought about Francis, about his life, about his mistakes. I thought about the man I had married, about the dreams we had shared, about the love we had once felt. I realized that Francis had been a complex man, a flawed man, but also a man capable of kindness, of compassion, of love. He had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but he had also tried to make amends. I let go of the last vestiges of anger and resentment. I forgave him completely. I walked away from the graveside, leaving Francis behind. I was ready to move forward, to embrace the future, to live my life to the fullest. I returned to the beach house, to David, to my family, to my life. I stood on the deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. I felt grateful, grateful for the love, for the laughter, for the peace, grateful for the lessons I had learned, for the strength I had found, for the life I had built. I was Alice Mercer, and I was finally home. The end.